going to be learning about AWS startups. So to begin, developing an idea. A founder's first goal is to create a product that solves a conflict for their customers. Founders should ask these following questions when they come up with their initial idea. First, who is the product for? Then, why is the product needed? What problem does it solve? And is that problem important enough to be solved? Is there a need for this product? According to Steve Blank, a famous Silicon Valley entrepreneur, more startups fail from a lack of customers than from a failure of product development. Next, finding a co-founder. Most successful startups have both a founder and a co-founder. Yet, despite this, most failures in startups are because of a conflict between the two founders. Therefore, it is important to be truthful about your strengths and weaknesses in order to find a co-founder that complements your own skills. Here are some following tips for hiring. First, do not give everyone a high title. Also, do not follow major companies' recruiting techniques, as you are only a startup. There are different rules for startups. Hire those who have faith in your company, and then have trial periods for these potential employees to see if they are the best fit. Next, understanding equity and compensation models. So it's important to not leave anything out of the discussion when it comes to equity distributions amongst the co-founders. This is because an unequal split of equity or profit can lead to distrust amongst co-founders, and as we stated, conflict amongst co-founders is the main reason startups fail. Therefore, giving an even share to each co-founder can help the company come first. And it is also important to have this equity discussion early on so that the lawyers and shareholders will not need to be involved later on in the process. Let's debunk some myths about startups. First, renting an office is unnecessary when starting off. Rather, you should try to work in a garage, library, coffee shop, or even a spare bedroom. If a formal work setting is required, then one can visit AWS lofts to be in the proximity of technical experts. You should try to keep an eye on monthly expenses such as your rent and payroll, while also measuring the rate at which profit grows. Also, it is important to measure the cost of acquiring new customers, and then following set timetables in order to keep on pace with all of your startup's goals. Next, customer discovery. So it's important to validate your idea, and you can do so by discussing your product with the people that you know. These include friends, families, and even potential customers. Customer discovery is when you evaluate, correct, and refine your idea, and doing so requires a repetitive cycle, including building, learning, testing, and then evaluating. The more customer feedback you get gives you the stronger, greater advantage as you have more feedback and more input from others, such as friends, family, and potential customers. And with a greater advantage and more customer feedback, you can tailor your product into giving customers what they actually crave. Here is a video discussing equity and compensation models for startups that will be linked in the description below of the live stream. Next, how to find and listen to customers. So interviews with customers are ultimately the best way that you can receive feedback, and this will help you figure out what actually matters to them. In order to find a good idea, you have to find a new way to please customers, and your goal should be to constantly update and keep up with the customer's needs. Doing so, you can determine whether your service will be used by consumers or even other businesses. And here are some tips for when communicating with your customers. First, you want to try to stay away from vague inquiries. You want to also try to avoid yes or no questions, as they don't give you much feedback. Instead, inquire fundamental questions that are more open-ended. These are designed to evince insight from your customers, and they're typically more beneficial to the feedback process. And lastly, you want to end conversations with customers by asking them who else they should talk to, so you can have a plan on who to talk to next to get more feedback on your product. Next, customer validation and understanding your market. So, customer validation is when you find and comprehend your customer's actual market. Just because there's enthusiasm for your product doesn't mean you necessarily have a large market. To determine the size of your market, ask yourself the following questions. Is your market large enough to support your business? How many people are actually willing to buy your product? Is this product a part of a new or already existing market? And see the click-through rate, if possible. Also, you could create a sign-up page for your product's launch to gauge interest. Furthermore, you want to consider how much money it will take to reach all these markets. Software-only products cost much less as compared to hardware-only products. Therefore, you also want to consider implementation roadblocks, such as following the certain rules for the specific industry that you are in. And knowing the competition and learning from their mistakes can help set your startup apart and ensure your own success. Next, building a prototype. A prototype is something that is created in order to see whether or not a certain product will succeed after launch. And in order to do so, you want to focus on learning about your product rather than coding and adding to it. And a prototype must be added to in order to make the product best suited for a customer's needs. Do not hurry the process for making a prototype, because it's important to get this initial stage correct. Check frequently to make sure the prototype actually follows the goal of your startup. Next, what is an MVP? So an MVP, or a minimal viable product, is typically the first product that a company makes. This is thought of as the simplest edition of a product that still proves the initial hypothesis that the startup was made for. The MVP has as little features as possible that are required to support the MVP's key function. Typically, this is the first product to be ready for the consumer market. However, this is usually just a test of the hypothesis and is really a bare-bones structure of what the idea was meant to be. So, therefore, like a prototype, an MVP won't be ideal, and instead it will prioritize functionality over any aesthetics. When it comes to developing an MVP, it goes through multiple repetitive cycles of designing, building, deploying, and then measuring. With each addition of new processes, the MVP will slowly become better, and this allows for quick and responsive feedback from users. It's important to keep the MVP simple. According to internet entrepreneur Reid Hoffman, if you aren't embarrassed by the first version of your product, you shipped too late. Therefore, it's important to add features after your hypothesis has been verified and your MVP has proven your initial idea. This is a video discussing what an MVP is, and as always, it will be linked below. Next, sprints. So sprints are a process that are oftentimes used when developing software, and it's a certain amount of time where predetermined work is completed. It's sort of like a game plan that is executed. It has a fixed theme and objective and a deliverable function. And the reason it's called a sprint is because it should only last 1 to 2 weeks. In fact, the shorter the better, as your goals will not change over a shorter time period. And then, following the conclusion of the sprint, you should save any customer feedback that you receive for the next time you do this. During a sprint, the prioritization should be on primary business functions. The work should be high effect and quick to build. According to Nikki Stone, senior software developer at AWS, you have the capacity to build one great product. Make sure it's the right one. The goal of a sprint is to create one objective measure of success. Therefore, the recommendations after sprints are continuous implementation and constant delivery. What are the potential pitfalls? So, an anti pattern is a universal response to a conflict, which is unproductive. An anti pattern is something you typically seek to avoid. However, being prepared for an anti pattern will help prevent whenever they undoubtedly and inevitably show up. Technical debt gathers when engineers rush through their work instead of focusing on quality and proper implementation. And technical debt does not necessarily come from laziness, but rather a strategic decision to swiftly eradicate a conflict. Furthermore, another pitfall is not generalizing code, which can actually lead to extra coding and work and refactoring. This is basically simply undifferentiated heavy lifting. Also, customers want the product and do not mind if you borrow from existing resources, so not everything must be done from scratch. What are some of the fundamentals of working with AWS? So, one thing that's important to understand is the difference between a one door and a two-door decision. These two types of decisions do not happen equally. Two-door decisions are the most common and occur the majority of the time. One-door decisions, however, should be thought through thoroughly. This is because after they are made, they cannot be remade, whereas two-way decisions offer a way back to remake the decision at a later point if necessary. An example of a one-door decision are security decisions. They cannot be remade. Therefore, when making these decisions, one should consider both their and AWS's responsibilities. These also include who gets access to certain objects amongst the workforce and how much access do these users receive. Startups on AWS receive enterprise level security, but AWS also offers SSL and DDoS protection. SSL stands for Secure Sockets Layer, standard security technology for creating a protected link between a web server and a browser is basically what SSL is. DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service. This is a cyber attack that interferes with the services of the host. Startups must know the relation between their own product with the government, healthcare, and more, and therefore follow any rules and regulations set forth in that field. Furthermore, points of integration must also be considered, as developers will not necessarily be able to understand a product without the proper documentation that in place. Another important term is an API, which is an application programming interface. These are a set of guidelines to connect with another person's software, and it's important to select the correct database for the type of data that you are looking to store. One moment, please. The slideshow has disappeared. I will pull it back up. All right. So, introduction to data architecture with AWS. So, a monolithic architecture is an architecture that combines all of the working parts of an application, such as data input, output, processing, error handling, and more, all together into a singular program. Doing so will allow for rapid development, as you do not need to make the processes ahead of time. And a well-designed monolith can be scaled both horizontally and then broken apart at a later date. Architecture applications such as Amazon's Elastic Beanstalk will automate all these processes for you, and they are much simpler to work and handle. Microservices are independent services that each perform their own functions, and they work together as a single product. However, the advantage of a microservice is that if one of them goes down, the others remain unaffected. Therefore, they are good for scaling large systems, but typically they take a longer time to build. You should look to optimize your data architecture for speed. Serverless architecture is a type of architecture where servers that code are running on The servers that the code is running on do not need to actually be set up by the user, and this grants the user more time to focus on the code itself rather than the servers. And the serverless coding can be automatically scaled for the user so that they don't have to predict their own customer traffic. Next, it's important to assess your legal needs as a startup. A common legal decision that a business needs to make is whether or not it wishes to become a legal entity. A legal entity is when a company gains legal rights and obligations like tax filings. There are multiple types of legal entities. For instance, there are limited liability or unincorporated entities. Limited liability is the detachment of personal resources from businesses' resources, and it prevents business owners' responsibility in losses and legal liability. These exist to help business owners take risks without the fear of legal action or liability. It's not perfect and is not a get out of jail free card, however. Unincorporated entities are for businesses that do not have limited liability. And there are two types, sole proprietorship and general partnerships. Sole proprietorship is owned by businesses and managed by one person. On the other hand, a general partnership has numerous owners and it splits up the responsibilities amongst these numerous owners. When it comes from a legal standpoint, there is no legal difference between the owner and the business itself. Therefore, sole proprietorship is cheaper to start, but it comes with less overhead as a result of only one owner. Um, the sole proprietorship model also risks the owner's own personal resources. Here's a crash course on data architecture. Next, finding a lawyer. An option for businesses that are a legal entity is to converse with large startup law firms. These types of firms do not make business owners pay upfront, but they take a percentage of the company instead. If businesses don't want to work with law firms, they can work with startup friendly firms like Atrium. Atrium is a corporate law firm that uses machine learning software to automate legal processes. Also, you could try to find counsel from a colleague/friend recommendation. Next, NDAs. So an NDA is a non-disclosure agreement that prevents unauthorized disclosure of secrets. If one is assigning development work to an outside organization, then it is best for that organization to sign an NDA. A venture capitalist provides startups with funds but receives a return investment, and a venture capitalist organization will most likely not sign an NDA. A founders agreement is a necessary legal step when there are multiple founders involved, and it can do all of the following. Also, an intellectual property or IP protection is another type of legal concept that provides legal protection. It is similar to a copyright, which guards original artistic work. And for most startups, copyright is the primary form of IP protection. Next, fundraising. As a startup, fundraising is a full-time job and should be taken seriously. Venture capital firms invest in companies they believe in and hope they will receive a large return as a result of their investment. There are multiple investment types, including pre-seed and Series A and B. Pre-seed is an investment that occurs early on, even before the company shows the product will work, whereas Series A and B is funding that is used to scale the business after it has already proven its initial idea. The pressure to deliver when a VC invests may be high, and it is likely that a business, even with the VC support, will be out of business in only a few years. Some VCs also work in pre-seed or seed funding, and this typically occurs in the early stages of product development, ranging from $50,000 to $250,000, whereas seed investments are larger, ranging from $250,000 to up to $1 million. In a year to a year and a half, a seed VC may actually want you to fundraise twice the amount that they gave you. And when fundraising with VCs, it simply adds another person to answer to. So, what are some funding sources outside of a VC? There are many different ways to raise money, including angel investors, non dilutive funding, crowdfunding, and accelerator programs. Angel investors are typically wealthy people looking to passively fund startups in exchange for equity and convertible debt. They don't want a huge 50-time return on investment, but they usually only are seeking a 3 to 5-time return. Non dilutive funding is a money that is incorporated in order to support the product without having to give up any equity. Think bank loans, university, or federal grants. Crowdfunding are examples including Kickstarter and GoFundMe, and these may assist in providing early adopters but may be more difficult than seed rounds. And lastly, there are accelerator programs. This is where you usually invest approximately $20 to $150,000, and they ask for typically a 5 to 7% equity return investment lasting about 3 months. Next, crafting a fundraising narrative. So, a fundraising narrative shows why one is spending money in the first place. It is not the same as a pitch deck, as it is typically much less thorough. And although this is true, some of the following questions must be answered. The narrative should be short and sweet and have the ability to be informally discussed. Think of trying to get a fundraising narrative done in 20 seconds. The first 10 seconds should be who you are, what you are doing, and why it's important. The last 10 seconds should be the progress you have made, your milestones, and your long term vision. You should try to find the one persuasive reason as to why your company should receive investment, and a good narrative should have a strong financial plan to support its initial claim.
Good morning, everyone.
Lastly, what makes a good pitch deck? So, your pitch deck is basically your business card. It is given to those who are in the best position to help you, such as investors and mentors. One of the first things customers will see is your pitch deck, and this will leave a huge impression about your company. Here are the following key areas of a pitch deck: the problems and solutions, the business model, and the market. When creating a deck, start with whatever is your most persuasive point and try to keep it incisive. It's better to be concise than to keep investors disinterested. Typically, keep your pitch deck to 10 to 13 slides and make sure they answer the following questions: why is this a good opportunity? Why is this the proper team to do it? And why is this round of funding necessary? When it comes to prospecting your initial fundraising funnel, it's important to generate contention amongst investors. You should try to be in the final negotiation stage with 3 investors all at the same time to leverage your offers. Some investor companies invest in numerous companies, while others only invest in a limited amount. Tools like Crunchbase and LinkedIn can help you find investors. Other entrepreneurs have VC companies that work with them, making it easy to get advice. Focus on people in the VC business rather than just the firms themselves. In fundraising mode, you should try to spend approximately 10% of your time creating relationships. Relationships can make it easy and quick to find high-level investments. Negotiate and finalize with an investor before moving on and searching for a new group. There are a couple different types of people working at a VC firm. Partners are generally the people that make the most decisions. Venture partners are only part-time workers and they make a couple of investments. Principals are new to the business and are just starting to make deals. And associates cannot make investments, but they can help business owners navigate through the investment process. Try to have a mutual acquaintance that introduces you to the investor so there is some connection. What are the stages of company growth? First, stage 1 is to deliver a product. Can your team actually build something consumers will buy? Next is expansion. Survival at this point is guaranteed, and now you're looking to build and further your success. You're now considered a more mature business and no longer a startup. You have to do your homework in order to reach stage 2, though. Next, a product roadmap is a guide that will help you through the whole business process, from making a product to making your first sale. It's important to create milestones throughout the map in order to help shareholders know where key events are on the timeline. A/B testing helps set apart two options when coming across how a certain variable might function, and A/B tests bring about valuable results about which option will perform the best based on a particular parameter or goal. These help make decisions less biased. An important decision when making a roadmap is deciding when it is time to pivot. If your product development team starts heading in the wrong direction, a pivot to your roadmap can help get things back on track. For instance, Instagram pivoted their idea from being a check in product to a place to post personal pictures, and they made it big. They then stripped off any non essential features in order to both save money and better the app. So don't be afraid to pivot. What are some common startup growing pains? Startups can cause long hours and be extremely demanding. There are ways to conduct business with greater results for your employees and your own product. Create and enforce strict limits on your work hours, and throwing all energy into startup can actually hurt your product and its effectiveness. Therefore, it's important to generate nourishment codes for all employees, which is basically a finish line. Pay a great amount of attention during your process as well, and employ people that fit your company culture. Interviewing is also critical, and it's important to consider if a candidate will contribute rather than just being a non-negative. A good interview question would be to ask how the candidate has worked through a real-life problem. And lastly, at a startup with less than 100 employees, the CEO themselves should be making all the hiring decisions. Next, culture. Culture is the persona of your company. It is a mixture of the following categories. Think about having third party voices to give a voice into the culture of your company. Culture isn't necessarily perks, and it's actually more difficult to generate. Information is received differently by different people, mentally speaking, and therefore it's important to find different ways to talk to employees en masse. A founder should personally interview at least 50 people for the first hires and therefore develop effective interview questions. Defining culture is not the end of a startup, though. Thank you. As always, all the videos will be linked below. We hope you learned something and